If I were to ask you to name who is the greatest American entrepreneur of all time, and you just kind of sit with that for a minute and think, of all the business titans, what some people may call the robber barons of American capitalism, who is the greatest of all time? Or even who's on the Mount Rushmore, like the top 4 or 5 capitalists of all time? Most people are going to think of names like Rockefeller and Carnegie, perhaps JP Morgan, maybe Cornelius Vanderbilt. More recently, you might say Elon Musk, perhaps Steve Jobs. One name that does not get enough credit is Walt Disney. So I want to try to convince you that Walt Disney is in fact the greatest American entrepreneur of all time. And that's largely because, unlike all of the capitalists I mentioned, Walt transformed multiple entirely different new industries from scratch, inventing both products that didn't previously exist, business models that didn't previously exist, and he did so largely in an industry that didn't exist before Walt Disney. Most of the greatest entrepreneurs of all time, like I said, the Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, Fords, they had very large industries to start with. Rockefeller in oil, Ford obviously helped pioneer automobiles, Carnegie with railroads, and then steel. If I could describe Walt Disney, what industry he built or transformed, it was something as intangible as storytelling. And yet he built a multi-billion-dollar company out of storytelling. And Walt, I think, proved that creativity itself could be a business. Now, in any endeavor, creativity obviously helps and enhances and accelerates your business. Rockefeller clearly applied creativity to the refining process. He applied creativity to his business model and the trust structure that made Standard Oil so effective in how they refined byproducts from the oil, everything from kerosene to gasoline. Vanderbilt employed creativity in the business model of lowering the fares on all the steamships and thus operating at a lower cost than everyone. He basically pioneered what we now consider the idea of a loss leader. So if you've ever enjoyed a dollar hot dog at Costco, thank Cornelius Vanderbilt for that business model. He practically invented that. Same with Morgan with financing, Carnegie, all these guys. Henry Ford, of course, it wasn't just automobiles that's the lasting legacy of Ford, it's the assembly line, right? So clearly creativity is present in any business, but Walt proved that creativity itself could be a business. Furthermore, I just think it's so interesting that up until the age of Walt Disney, if you wanted to succeed in business, you needed either capital or access to people who would loan you capital. Walt kind of proved that, hey, I don't need a ton of money to start a factory or a ton of money to buy a bunch of inventory or land to lay railroad track. Creativity in some instances can be a substitute for capital in capitalism. Of course, even the word capitalism was a name given to our free market system by its opponents, right? It was supposed to be a pejorative, kind of just assuming that, oh, the only people who can thrive in a capitalist system are people who inherit wealth. Walt's journey really proves that to be complete nonsense. It's especially spicy because his father was a card-carrying member of the American Socialist Party. This is a photo from the early 1920s of Walt and his brother Roy, who founded the Disney Brothers studio together formally in 1923. Now, he had started his first studio, which ended up going bankrupt actually when he was 18, technically before age 18. And he was given the choice when that first business failed, do I declare bankruptcy or could I escape via basically a paperwork loophole of saying I was a minor and I didn't know what I was signing when I took on all this money in debt. And he chose to go through formal bankruptcy because even though people were telling him, hey, you can get out of this by saying you were a minor and you didn't know what you were doing, he believed in just doing business the right way and that his reputation and his brand as a person, as an individual, a personal brand, that actually mattered. And we'll get more to that in a second. But the first main contribution I think that Walt made, not just to the entertainment industry, but to business as a whole, is this idea of brand and that your brand matters. He's not the person who invented the idea of a brand. That had existed over 100 years prior. If you would go in the mid-19th century to a general goods store and you say, hey, I want some flour and some eggs, branding kind of came to be because people realized there's just a giant barrel of flour over here, or boxes of eggs. I don't really know what eggs I'm getting or where the flour came from or where this milk came from. And eventually the owners of these stores started realizing if we could create a brand and say, you're buying this brand of toothpaste or you're buying this brand of soap, people would pay a price premium. What they were buying was certainty, that they knew that this is the soap I get when I buy this brand, or this is the quality of flour I get when I buy this brand. That's how brands started, really, as a risk mitigation strategy. It was a sense of quality control, that this is what I'm getting when I buy this type of soap. And if I go to any store in the country that carries this brand of soap, I know I'm going to get this certain quality of soap or eggs, flour, etc. Walt applied that to the idea of a person. He wanted the name Walt Disney to mean something. And it goes back to how we got into Hollywood. So he goes bankrupt in Kansas City, moves out to Hollywood. This is kind of classic Walt. He doesn't have money for a suitcase. He literally just went bankrupt. So his suitcase is literally fashioned out of cardboard and tied together. And yet the money he did scrounge up, he bought a first-class ticket out to California, which would be the equivalent of using a Walmart bag as your carry-on, but flying first class out to California. And he shows up and wants to get into the movie making industry, because this is the early 1920s, entering the golden age of Hollywood, but he has no contacts. I guess he was the founder of a failed film company. He really has no network. He wants to get into feature movie making, but he realizes, I don't have any advantage there. So the only reason to this day that he went into animation was he figured there's a lower barrier to entry there. There's less competition there. Less people are interested in animation, therefore I'll do that to kind of break through. But what he really wanted to do was make feature-length movies. So he gets into animation and quickly realizes that it's hard. You know, at the time, there was no such thing as a feature-length cartoon. The animated shorts were typically 5-minute shorts that played before a movie. So today, if you go to a movie, you have to sit through all the previews before the actual movie starts. We watch trailers before a movie. That's what they used cartoons for. Like, before the actual movie you were paying for, there'd be a bunch of just juvenile, amateur, slapstick humor, very rough. There wasn't any storyline or anything. It was just like dumb cartoons for 5 minutes to just give you a quick giggle before the movie started. They were not serious, not a lot of thought went into them. Like I said, not really any plot or character development, just 5 minutes slapstick humor shorts before the actual movie started. And so because of that, the movie distributors were not really willing to pay a premium for people making these cartoons, because it didn't really affect the demand of ticket sales. What cartoon they threw before a movie did not change at the end of the day who was going to go see that movie, how many people were going to show up. So this is one of the first times that Walt, I think, realizes that if I can find a way to create a character, create a brand where people will actually go out of their way to go see this movie because my cartoon is attached to it, then I would have a little bit of pricing power in my negotiation with the distributors, because I can actually show data and say, hey, people want to see this character, therefore I'm going to charge you more for the rights to use my cartoons. So prior to Walt having this realization, the idea of brand didn't really exist in Hollywood. And I would argue it still doesn't really exist today. Walt was the first person to realize, what if a Walt Disney picture, like that phrase, before a movie actually meant something? So today, if we go see or we even hear about a movie, hey, there's a new Walt Disney movie, already without any context, you sort of know what that movie is going to be about. Or at a minimum, you know what it's not going to be about. It's probably going to be family friendly. If it's a Walt Disney film, it's not going to have a bunch of sex or violence or gore. It's probably aimed at children. You know what a Walt Disney picture means. At the time, all the studios back then, there was Warner Brothers. Still to this day, if I'm like, Tim, what's your favorite Warner Brothers movie? I'd be like, I don't know. I have no idea in my top 10 list of movies which one is a Warner Brothers film and which one is not. Probably the same thing for MGM, and you could go on, Paramount, all the studios. I don't honestly know which movies are made by which studios. You could copy and paste the intro into any movie and I would have no idea. Fun fact, this is a behind the scenes photo of them filming the original MGM intro where they actually had to photograph that lion. I cannot imagine being one of those guys standing there with a lion about to eat you. But when you see this logo, this is, by the way, the Disney animation logo from the 90s, my childhood. And when I see that come on the screen, all sorts of nostalgia just floods. I think of seeing Hunchback of Notre Dame in theaters, or Pocahontas, or Toy Story, right? And that logo and that brand means something. At the time, though, it didn't. Walt was the first person to kind of stumble on this idea of brand. What if the brand actually meant something where I could charge more? And because I have more money, then I could make better cartoons and better pictures, which would make more money. And then I could charge more. And it's kind of this flywheel of quality creating more profits that builds a moat around your castle. So Disney really pioneered the idea of brand in entertainment. I have firsthand experience in this. I actually worked at Walt Disney World when I was in college. I joined the Disney College program, and they are obsessed with brand. I am probably, I probably was the most overqualified person to ever take a minimum wage job at Walt Disney World because I went there not wanting money. I wanted to learn how they trained their employees, which are, by the way, called cast members at Walt Disney World. Everything follows this theme of the show. So you're a cast member, you're not an employee. You don't take your breaks in a break room. There's on stage and there's backstage. I had to go to costuming every day to pick up my costume because they don't have uniforms, they have costumes, right? So everything at Disney is about this theme and this brand of the show. So I went to the Disney program just to learn how they train their employees. And the first 3 days that I get there, it's 3 days on the history of the company. So even for a minimum wage job, I'm working in attractions, which is a fancy way of saying I press the on button when you go on a ride at Disney World. And I had to go through 3 full paid 8-hour days on the history of the Walt Disney Company, because they want someone in a minimum wage job to know. If someone asked me, hey, what year was Mickey Mouse created? I'd be like, 1928. What year was the Disney Studio Incorporated? 1923. What year did such and such movie come out? And you would know. They wanted even the lowest level employees, the lowest rung on the ladder, to actually be trained on the history and heritage of the company. Because an advantage to this day that Disney has over other entertainment companies is that sense of heritage and that brand, right? Can you imagine like a Starbucks barista having to go through 3 full 8-hour paid days of training on the history of Howard Schultz? I mean, no other companies do anything close to this. Even janitors have to go through this, which, by the way, at Disney, there's no janitors, there's showkeepers. They keep the show clean. So even a janitor has to go through 3 days of the traditions training. That's what they call it. Disney takes the brand seriously. Actually, on the first day, I was almost fired. I was sent home on my very first day because I showed up in violation of the Disney look, which is, again, the standards they have for the brand, that you have to have this all-American clean-cut look. So no tattoos. Men weren't allowed to have earrings. Your hair has to be a totally natural color, so you can't show up with like pink or purple hair. They want this kind of all-American, family-friendly look, and that also means no facial hair for guys, probably for women too. And I showed up, and the stubble I have right now would absolutely get me kicked out. They'd be like, go to Universal if I showed up looking like this, right? So I showed up, and I knew all this. Keep in mind, I had read even before I got the job, I had read all sorts of biographies about Walt Disney, watched every documentary. I was obsessed with the man, Walt Disney. And so I get sent home my first day because the manager comes up to me and says, you're in violation of the Disney look. And I was like, what? He's like, you have stubble. And I was just like, didn't know what to say because it's like 7 a.m. And I had shaved the night before at like 10 p.m. before I went to sleep because I knew that you had to shave before you went in. But apparently my 5 o'clock shadow at 7 a.m. was too much. And so they sent me home. He just gave me a disposable razor and said, go shave. And I was just mortified. Like, okay, what do I do if I work a 14? Because often during like spring break, especially in the month of March, you're working 14-hour shifts. So you work 6 or 7 hours, take a long lunch break, and then work a whole shift after that. I was like, by the end of my shift, I will logically be in violation. He just, he put his arm around me and said, we'll talk about that later. For now, you need to go shave. And so I had that experience on my very first day. Can you even imagine a modern corporation taking that level of seriousness with their employees' look? For a minimum wage job, I was standing in the dark all day. People wouldn't be able to see. I was at an indoor attraction that I worked. So that was my first experience in how seriously Disney takes their brand. So this is another kind of older photo of Walt and his brother Roy. And throughout the 1920s, and really frankly throughout the history of their entire company, they were constantly almost broke. No matter how much money Walt made, his ideas that he would have of how to spend the money were always so much greater than the amount of money he made that they were almost always going out of business, no matter if they were talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions, tens of millions, eventually hundreds of millions. Walt would find a way to reinvest the money, and it was Roy's job to just find a way not to go bankrupt. So to say that Roy had a finance background, he eventually became the CFO of the company, but he worked at a teller at a bank, you know. But they started this company together. Neither of them had any formal business background, but what they knew was they could, like I said, they could crack through. They could find a way to carve out a name for this Disney Brothers Studio, is what it was first called, if they could find a way to convince distributors that their characters for these cartoon shorts were better than the alternatives. They could charge more. And Walt worked really hard to develop a character called Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. Most of you have probably never heard of Oswald the Lucky Rabbit because it was stolen from Walt Disney in kind of a paperwork contract hostile takeover where he got into negotiations with his distributor in New York. And frankly, they just knew more about contracts than Walt did. And Walt didn't realize that he had signed away the rights to Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. And so when a contract got particularly in a fierce negotiation, he found out that the distributor had actually hired away all of his animators from underneath him, also owned the rights to Oswald. And so this character that was kind of ascending in popularity, overnight, Walt finds out, I don't actually own any of the rights to Oswald. They've hired my animators. I have nothing. So as the story goes, he's on a train ride home from New York City, coming back to California, and he calls his wife, Lillian, and says, I think I have an idea. I'm going to come up with this new character. It's going to be a mouse. I'm going to name him Mortimer. And Lillian says, oh my God, that is the literal worst name I have ever heard in my life. Please do not name him Mortimer. And Walt Disney, whose family is Irish, says, what about Mickey? And so they said, okay, that's fine. We'll name him Mickey. And the idea was Mickey was going to be this mouse. It's really like Walt. It's really Walt in animated form. It's this kind of spunky, punchy, all-American character who you just can't help but want to root for, right? He's always doing things and getting into things he shouldn't be, but he finds a way, kind of has this like can-do all-American attitude of I'm going to figure out how to get what I want in life. And Walt actually, in the early Mickey shorts, Walt is the voice. So it's actually just Walt Disney in falsetto. So if you go on YouTube and just search early Walt Disney shorts, that is literally Walt's voice voicing Mickey. So they come out with the Mickey character and cash starts flowing in. Walt has finally achieved this brand where he can charge more money from the distributors because people are actually calling movie theaters and saying, is there a Mickey Mouse cartoon before this movie? And if there's not, they're literally going to another theater because they want to see Mickey before the movies. This had never happened before. It totally caught the whole industry off guard because people didn't care what cartoon shorts, in the same way that none of you in this room, myself included, would ever call AMC before going to a movie and say, what trailers are playing before the movie? And they'd be like, I don't know. You're like, well, that's going to affect whether I go here or go to Regal. You know, people were doing that because they wanted to see Mickey Mouse cartoons. And then the Great Depression hits. The Disney Brothers studio is actually largely saved from the worst parts of the Great Depression, at least relative to other studios, because they never got overinvested, overexpanded in buying movie theater chains. Almost every other studio did this. They figured when times were good in the Roaring 20s, we're going to vertically integrate and we're going to make these movies, but we're also going to own the physical movie theaters, right? So all the other studios were using their profits to buy out movie theaters and actually own their distribution channels. Disney, whether it was his wise business strategy or frankly lack thereof, he didn't want to do that. He wanted to put all the money back into making better Mickey cartoons. So they would add more detail. He would hire actual artists to train the animators to become just better artists, and all the money went back into just making Mickey better. So if you also go back and watch cartoons and anything animated from the 1920s and 30s, one thing you'll notice is that Mickey Mouse and just anything coming out of Disney animation at the time, which includes like the Three Little Pigs, it's just better than any other studio out there. It is noticeably better art. Like the animation is smoother, it's more lifelike, they're just better. That's where Walt Disney puts all of his money. Walt, throughout his life, honestly, this is just another trend we'll see time and time again in the history of the company, never cares about profit in the way that we think of it today. He thinks of profit as just the fuel to which I can fund more of my future ideas. He doesn't do things for profit. He does things for excellence, and then he knows that if his vision of excellence in his head can be achieved in real life, then money will follow because people will want to pay to participate in that. But he doesn't do things just for the money. So just automatically, because of that mindset, he has a longer-term vision. Whether or not he intuitively knew this, he has a longer-term vision for a lot of his business endeavors. So the Great Depression hits. Disney's one of the only studios that's not hit really hard, but they're still struggling because people are going to less and less movies. And so the Mickey character is doing well, but the overall economy is not. I mean, unemployment, we think it's bad now and people complain. We're at like 4% unemployment right now. We had 25% unemployment in the Great Depression. And they're struggling to figure out, how do we get more money coming in, because Walt keeps finding ways to spend it. And Roy contacts a guy named Kay Kamen, who becomes legendary in kind of the Disney lore and mythology. Kay Kamen comes up with the idea of merchandising. What if we license some of our brand assets to other manufacturers, other companies, and then we'll split the profits? And he reaches out to a company called Ingersoll Waterbury. Has anyone heard of Ingersoll Waterbury? A couple people. He decides, what if we license Mickey Mouse to appear on a watch? The watch costs $3. This is back in 1933, the height of the Great Depression. $3. It's about $75 if you adjust it for inflation. So $3 sounds really cheap, but in the middle of the Great Depression, a $75 watch wasn't really affordable to the average person. And yet Ingersoll is going out of business. The Disney company is also flirting with bankruptcy in 1933, even despite all the actual millions of dollars Walt has made. They're flirting with bankruptcy. And they said, all right, well, it can't hurt if we do this and no one buys it. It's not like it cost a ton of money to make a couple thousand watches. They try it. The first day they sell 11,000 watches. Within a couple years, they've sold so many watches that Ingersoll Waterbury has had to, which by the way was going out of business at the time. Ingersoll Waterbury scales up from just shy of 300 employees to just shy of 3,000 employees. So it 10x'd the size of this company solely because of the Mickey Mouse watch. They had to add new factories, add new shifts. Over time, they sold 25 million of these watches. Now, most people have probably never heard of Ingersoll Waterbury, but you might know of the company that they later changed their name to, Timex, because of the Mickey Mouse watch. It literally saved and made the company Timex that we know today. It also saved Walt Disney Studios. In the midst of the Great Depression, it brought in such a flood of money that Walt was able to pursue a new way of spending it all, which was, I'm going to make a feature-length cartoon. This had never been done before. Again, up until this time, people thought of cartoons, even Disney shorts, as 5-minute little previews before the actual movie, right? There had been no such thing as a feature-length cartoon. You know, today we think, you know, there's plenty of movies. We think of Disney movies and DreamWorks movies and, you know, these other studios that have made feature-length cartoons. At the time, they didn't exist. It was absolutely preposterous to think that someone would sit down and watch a 75-minute or a 90-minute cartoon. That was absurd. But he announced, we're going to make a feature-length cartoon. And it's important that this happened in the middle of the Great Depression, because most historians agree that there is no way that Walt would have been able to assemble the talent and basically absorb all the best artists and animators in the country had it not been the Great Depression, because basically he just sucked up all the best talent from all the other studios when he announced, we're making a feature-length cartoon. Any animator worth their salt, if they were working at another company, wanted to go work for the Disney company because they wanted to be part of history. This was like being a rocket scientist in the 1960s. Like, you would work at NASA or you'd probably go find a new job, because why would you even want to be a rocket scientist in the 1960s and not be working at NASA? right? That's what the Disney studio felt like in the 1930s. He basically started advertising, we're going to make a feature-length animated movie, and all the best of the best wanted to go work for the Walt Disney Company. So he starts making this movie, and the critics labeled it immediately as Disney's folly. So they just expected it would fail. Every critic out there was like, clearly this is going to suck, and no one is going to sit through a 75-minute cartoon. This is hilarious that he's even trying, and it's a shame that someone has accomplished, because at this time, Walt has already won Academy Awards. Like, he was a very respected name because of the Three Little Pigs and, of course, Mickey Mouse. He was famous when he traveled abroad. People would line up even in Europe to go meet him. I mean, he was globally famous at this time, and everyone thought he's just throwing his reputation away on this stupid feature-length movie. And he picked a fairy tale by the Brothers Grimm, Snow White, to be his first animated film. He estimated it would cost about $250,000. So they had that much money. Eventually, they had to go to Bank of America and get loans. Then they had to go back and get more loans. And they had to go back and get more loans. And it got to the point where banks weren't going to loan them money anymore, because the project ballooned from $250,000 to $1.5 million. Keep in mind, this had never been done before. So Walt probably was lying, but he wasn't lying maybe to that extent that he actually thought it could get done for $250,000, because it had never been done before, right? It's kind of like when Elon Musk promises that we're going to be in Mars in 2 weeks, and it's like, well, it might be like 15 years, but, you know, close. He has no idea really what the project's scope is, because it's never been done before, right? So they have to keep getting these loans, keep getting those loans. Finally, one of the bankers from Bank of America calls him in early 1937 and says, the bank's, like the board of Bank of America is making me fly out. You need to show me what you have. Like, whatever rough draft you have, I need to see it so we know what we're funding. Because keep in mind, every time they send $100,000, that's like the modern equivalent of sending millions, right? If you adjust that for inflation. And this has never been done before. So the bank might lose all of our investment. You know, it's kind of like if you owe the bank $100,000, that's your problem. But if you owe the bank $100 million, that's the bank's problem, right? They were getting nervous. We're pumping a ton of money into this, and we have no idea what we're even investing in. So he goes and he sees this movie. Walt shows him at the studio, doesn't mention it. They're making small talk. They're walking back to his car. He has to catch his flight back to New York. And Walt is getting really nervous because the guy hasn't even brought up what he thinks of it. They're just small talking all the way to the car. He opens up the door, sits in the back seat. He has a professional driver about to drive him off. And just as kind of an aside, he looks up at Walt and says, oh, by the way, that picture of yours, that's going to make a pile of money. Then he shuts the door, drives away, and they continued funding it. So the movie comes out, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, in December of 1937. Again, a feature-length film had never been attempted ever. Really nothing longer than 10, 15 minutes had ever been attempted. I think Snow White's about 75 minutes long. All sorts of artistic techniques that had never been attempted in a film are present in this movie. Even the color palettes, if you look at what Snow White feels like aesthetically versus the cartoons at the time, are very different. They actually tried to avoid really bright colors because that was common in most shorts of the time, because Walt smartly realized people are not going to just watch a 75-minute movie of constant bold colors. It needs to be a little bit more earthy tones, a little bit more muted, so that when we use color, you actually notice it. He also went out of his way to make sure that it wasn't just a musical where there's music in it and there's songs, but the music feels natural and inherent in the plot. It's not just like Snow White steps up and now I'm going to sing a song, you know, because that's what most cartoons, animated features were. They were kind of this slapstick, just juvenile amateur approach to filmmaking that didn't really have a sense of plot arc. Walt was obsessed with story as well. That's what made Snow White work. At the end of the day, it was story. He was the first ever studio to have a story department where he spent millions of dollars a year employing story artists who weren't animators. Their full-time job was just making sure the story worked. And the individual characters had character arcs and the plot was going somewhere, right? That an adult could watch it and enjoy it because it actually had a story, right? I think to this day, that's actually what separates most Disney and Pixar films apart from their competition, is that Yeah, kids like them, of course, but there's usually a plot arc and character development, and adults get something out of it as well, even though adults don't necessarily prefer animated films. Walt understood this intuitively. Keep in mind, this had never been done before. He just kind of understood that if this is going to work, kids have to like it, but you know who's going to drive the kids to the movie theater? Parents. So adults also have to like it. So it debuts in December 1937 at the Carthay Circle. All of Hollywood's top brass shows up. Shirley Temple's there, Clark Gable. I mean, everyone of a who's who in Hollywood is at this premiere. Keep in mind, no one knows how it's going to go because no one has ever seen a feature-length cartoon before. So just imagine what it's like being Walt Disney in that theater that night. He's either about to achieve his lifelong dream of making a feature-length animated movie, or he's about to be utterly humiliated and go completely bankrupt because he had, at this point, has mortgaged his house. I mean, at the time when they started, keep in mind, he's a decamillionaire already. He's already like post-economic, has more money than he knows what to do with, has put everything back into making Snow White. They even mortgaged the future profits of Mickey Mouse and any characters at the Disney studio. So like if this doesn't work, Disney is just going out of business, frankly, and Walt's going to be working for the bank the rest of his life to pay off the debt. I can't even fathom what that would feel like when that movie starts, just how nervous he is standing in the back of the room, like, are people gonna like this? Are they gonna applaud? You know, and it gets to the very end of the movie. And spoiler alert, Snow White dies. It's like 100 years old, so that's on you if you haven't seen it at this point. She eats a poisoned apple, which, by the way, this is kind of like an interesting Ayn Rand connection, that the villain in the movie, the evil queen, hates Snow White because Snow White is better looking than her, which is kind of an example of hatred of the good because it is good. So she poisons Snow White, kills her. There's this horrible scene where you see the hand and Snow White drops the apple and Snow White is dead. And this is like shocking to the crowd because up until this point, again, there has never been an animated movie that has any sense of like pathos or feeling or substance. People were expecting just this jolly dwarves dancing around to music, and that's what the first Act 1 and Act 2 of this movie are, right? The final third of the movie, it starts to get serious and you realize like, oh, this is not like a movie just for 5-year-olds. And Walt looks over and there's this scene where Snow White is in her glass coffin, she's dead, and the dwarves are crying. And Walt said when they animated that, they had only the best people animate that scene because he realized this scene is going to make or break my entire career. If this scene works and we can get people to feel something emotionally, the movie works. If it doesn't, the movie doesn't work. And Walt looks over and into the crowd and sees Clark Gable kind of like, Clark Gable is crying. And in that moment, Walt is just, we did it. This movie is going to work. The whole theater was crying. I mean, every animator, Walt Disney, everyone in the theater will testify that like everyone was just like losing it at the end because they didn't expect the movie to have this much pathos at the end. Snow White goes on to make $8 million off of a budget of $1.5 million. If you adjust that for modern day, both with inflation, but also other variables, like so many of the people who saw this movie were children who were getting in cheaper than a normal ticketed price, it would have made about $1.5 billion in today's money in the middle of the Great Depression. So it already would be a top 10 movie of all time. And yet foreign markets were largely locked out because in the mid to late 1930s, Hitler takes over Europe and wants to shield Nazi Germany from any Western influence. So they eventually blocked out, Disney movies, and the Asian market, of course, China, Japan, etc., didn't really exist for all intents and purposes at this time. So comparing global box office numbers from today to then, there are many people who make a compelling argument that Snow White is absolutely the greatest box office hit of all time, and it's not even close. If you're actually comparing, no pun intended, apples to apples. And he risked everything to make this movie happen. This is a theme throughout Walt Disney's life, that he was never satisfied with making a bunch of money and just enjoying it. His his money was just fuel for the next crazy project he dreamt up in his mind. And this is why I respect him so much, because as an entrepreneur myself, honestly, I can't fathom taking that level of risk. Where when you finally achieve a nice life and you can fly first class and you can go buy a new car and you finally afford to, buy your own house, he takes multiple mortgages against his house, he sells his Moon Roadster, he cashes out his life insurance policy. So had he died of a heart attack of the stress, his family actually would have been broke because he cashed out his life insurance policy to fund this. And it works. And it doesn't just do it once, he does it multiple times throughout his career. It reminds me of the Howard Roark character from the book The Fountainhead, where Roark says, I don't have clients, or I don't build in order to have clients, I have clients in order to build, right? Walt Disney is just a real life Howard Roark. If you haven't read the book The Fountainhead, that reference might not make sense to you, but for those of you who have read The Fountainhead, the more you study Walt Disney, I mean, the parallels are crazy how much Howard Roark's philosophy is evident in the life of Walt Disney. So constantly, again, throughout his life, he's finding ways to reinvest the profits into doing cooler things. And often it doesn't work. That's the takeaway that I see as a business owner that gives me hope that everything you do isn't going to be awesome. Everything is not going to be a hit. So he makes Snow White is just rolling in the dough, spends all of the money building a brand new state-of-the-art campus in California. It was like the Google of its time, like one of the first corporate centers to have air conditioning. He has a cafeteria where employees can, go get their food. There's volleyball courts and softball fields. The absolute Silicon Valley, before Silicon Valley, was the Disney Studios in Southern California in the 1930s and 40s after Snow White. He was just rolling in the money. He pays for Pinocchio, he pays for Dumbo, he pays for Fantasia, and all these movies lost money in the 1940s. So every movie he does for about 10 years after Snow White just bleeds money, doesn't make any money whatsoever. And by the end of the 1940s, he's broke again. So he made all this money and yet reinvested all of it, and it didn't quite work. But the business model saves them. So the Disney company today is really an artifact, I think, of Walt's vision of how he thought about business even way back when. So today, let's just use some modern numbers here. The Disney company, I think last year did about $91 billion of gross revenue. $91 billion. Only about 10% of that, though, was box office revenue. So Walt understood early on that we're going to build characters and brands that transcend an individual movie, because that has lasting value over time if we develop a character and a brand that breeds multiple movies and Mickey Mouse watches, right? Merchandising and Disney Cruise Lines and Disneyland and Disney World. We're standing on sacred ground here, right? It all starts from making movies and characters and experiences that emotionally resonate with people. So $91 billion last year, less than 10% of that is box office revenue. About 5 times as much money is made at the Walt Disney Company on merchandising and experiences. So like I said, if you've ever gone on a Disney cruise, if you've gone to Disneyland or Disney World, or your daughter has Moana figurines or Mickey Mouse plush toys or Star Wars action heroes or all of the various toys and licensing, right? They make 5 times as much money on that. If you look at the Disney company from kind of a business analysis perspective, they IPO in 1957. And unlike most IPOs today, honestly, which are basically Ponzi schemes where the investors want to sell the stock for a higher price than they paid for it, only because they want to find someone dumber to buy the stock at a higher price, Disney does not IPO as a liquidity event. He's not IPOing to get rich, which is honestly most modern IPOs. He's IPOing for the old-fashioned reason they actually need money to grow. Because even in the mid-1950s, after they've technically started Disneyland, this is after Cinderella saves the company in 1950 from the lost decade of the 1940s. Even after all this, they're still broke because Walt keeps coming up with creative ways to spend the money he makes. So they have to IPO. Roy has literally ran out of banks and institutional investors, life insurance companies and whatnot, to loan them money. There are no larger financial institutions that can extend the Disney company any more credit, so they have to go public and offer equity to the general public. And so they IPO in 1957. And Walt does not want to do this. He understands the loss of control, but Roy eventually comes to him and says, there's no other way. Like, we're going to go under if we can't raise capital, and there's no one willing to loan us money anymore. And so they go public. If you had invested $10,000 in the 1957 initial public offering, that $10,000 would today be worth a little bit over $30 million. Now, I know most of you are probably thinking, well, yeah, but the stock market has grown a ton since then and inflation. So what did the general market do in that time? Well, if you invested $10,000 in a broad-based like S&P index fund, it didn't actually exist back then, but we can extrapolate what it would have been worth just based on overall market returns. $10,000 invested in the broad market today would be worth about $8 million. So the Walt Disney Company outperformed the market over that 50+ year time horizon by over 4x. That's crazy. It's one of the greatest retail investments in the history of American capitalism. If you had invested in the company at that time, it was already pretty mature too. So it wasn't like you were investing at like the angel or seed level. It was already a pretty large company at that time. It's grown that much since then. So Disney understood that if you create a brand and you create characters and stories that people resonate with, that has long-lasting effects beyond the initial movie. Hollywood really, back then and today, operates on kind of a venture capital model where 75% of movies, even with all we know about audience polling and testing and now AI, 75% of movies lose money. So all the money that goes into producing films, only 25% of films make any money whatsoever. The average movie today requires about $20 to $50 million or so. And again, 75% of them don't make money. Disney took a different approach and still does. They're willing to spend $50 to $100 to $200 million on a movie because even if that movie breaks even, they want to take bigger bets because if they establish larger than life characters that transcend just that movie, that people are thinking of them and they have cultural staying power 50 years later, they'll make their money back in the long run. I mentioned earlier that Dumbo was one of the movies that came out in the early 1940s and it lost money. It was a commercial failure, as did Bambi, as did Fantasia, Pinocchio. And yet I took my daughter Rose to Disney World for the first time earlier this year. We went on the Dumbo ride at Disney World. That day she happened to be coincidentally wearing a Dumbo dress. And so 100 years later, Disney is still taking my money from a character in a movie that apparently lost money. The question becomes, did it really lose money? Disney is always playing a longer game than its competitors, and he's always looking for ways to bring these visions in his head into reality. Because Walt could never, Walt was not okay with the cognitive dissonance of an idea existing in his mind and not being able to see it through in reality. Like, I think the only entrepreneur that even comes close would be Elon Musk. And I've told many people, Elon Musk is basically just Walt Disney with a higher SAT score. He was unable to live with himself if he couldn't take action on his ideas. Him and his brother Roy had multiple shouting matches throughout this over the years, and they threatened to quit multiple times because Roy was like, why can't we just take 2 years and enjoy some of the profits and not spend it all immediately? And Walt was not okay with that. So he funded Disneyland, and he planned and envisioned Disneyland, which is the first ever example of a theme park. Theme parks didn't exist before Disneyland. There were amusement parks, there were carnivals, but they were kind of sketchy and not really family-friendly places. Walt envisioned, what if there was a park that was clean and family-friendly, and you would actually want to bring your young daughter there, your young family, and it had a theme, and the theme was obviously Disney characters, movies, the ideas of imagination and wonder and fantasy. This did not exist at the time. Again, people labeled it Disney's folly because there's no way this is going to work. They're spending so much capital on this. Even at the time, as rich as he was by the mid-1950s, he didn't have money for it. He cashed out everything, his life insurance policy, the mortgage on his house. It still wasn't even close to enough. They got a huge loan from Bank of America. It still wasn't enough money. They had to go to ABC and have ABC fund the remainder of Disneyland. ABC at the time was one of the three major networks. It was CBS, NBC, ABC. ABC was getting their butt kicked across the board. It was a distant third to NBC and CBS. None of the major shows on TV at the time were ABC shows. And so they asked Walt, hey, could you make a show for us basically for free? And if you pay for it, or if you do the show for free on ABC, The Wonderful World of Disney, which many of you probably recognize that. I actually just watched The Sandlot on TV with my daughter this past week. It was the Sunday night movie on The Wonderful World of Disney, which is still going, like 70 years later. They said, we will pay for the remainder of the construction of the park if you do the show for us for free. So he does. They get the park built. It opens, absolute smash hit. I mean, it was just printing money. The first day was an epic disaster. I could probably give a whole nother talk about how much of a failure opening day of Disneyland was. Like the asphalt wasn't all dry, so people's like shoes were melting into the pavement when they walked in. There was a plumber's strike because there was like the union was negotiating with them and actually sabotaged a lot of the plumbing on purpose so that it would be a disaster. I mean, it was an absolute just unmitigated. It was embarrassing. And yet they figured it out. It worked. It made tons of money. It's just another example of Walt investing everything in an idea that he thought would work. Where we're standing right now is what Walt called the Florida Project. Most people don't realize that Disney World was never supposed to be a theme park. Disney in his mind imagined, what if I could build a for-profit city in a special economic zone that could prove to the whole world like how mighty American capitalism can actually be without the constraints of normal government planners and a normal government oversight. So he got a special charter from the state of Florida, very similar to what Shenzhen and eventually Hong Kong was to China, that we're going to start a private for-profit city. So actually to this day, the water and the road system and the emergency services in and around Disney World is managed by the Disney company. It's not the state of Florida. It was never supposed to be a theme park. It was supposed to be a sprawling complex where Disney would personally build and own and operate the hospitals, and there would be a university system, and there would be housing and transportation and parks, and he was actively recruiting all of the top companies at the time, so Ford and GM and GE, to move their headquarters or move their R&D departments here because he wanted it to be the most futuristic city in the world with the smartest minds, the most cutting-edge research was going to be here in Orlando, Florida, and he wanted to prove that there was a better way of running a city. And yet, in 1966, Walt discovers he has lung cancer. He was a lifetime smoker. And he passes away in December of 1966. And that dream dies with him, and that vision dies with him, and the executives don't know what to do because Walt has all of the vision and the creativity of this company in his mind, and so they just turn it into another theme park. Many of you have probably been to Epcot. What most people don't realize is that Epcot is an acronym. There's a reason it's always capitalized. Epcot stands for Experimental Prototype City of Tomorrow. It was supposed to be a functioning private for-profit city that would show the world the magic of the American free enterprise system, almost a sense of a permanent World's Fair with actual people living and working there full time. But that dream really dies with Walt. Just by a super quick show of hands, actually not show of hands, you can just shout it out. What is your favorite Disney movie of all time? Okay, I heard Cars, Aladdin, I think someone said Mulan, Snow White. I've asked this to many audiences, and every time people shout out tons of movies, which, by the way, if I ask you your favorite DreamWorks movie, most people won't even be able to name a DreamWorks movie. You've probably seen them, but you don't necessarily know it's DreamWorks, right? No one ever names a Disney movie that came out in about the 25-year period where Walt died in 1966 to when The Little Mermaid came out in 1989. That's considered like the Disney Renaissance period, the 1990s. For about nearly 25 years after that, there was a period of creative bankruptcy in the Walt Disney Company where they just didn't make good movies. The company lost its mojo. That creative driving force that Walt brought to the studio every day was gone. I don't know if in any other company ever in the history of the United States, one person has made that much of an impact on the Enterprise that Walt Disney did. The last known scene from Walt's life, he's lying in a hospital bed in Burbank, California, and he's with his brother Roy, and Roy is rubbing his feet. His feet have become really, really swollen, and Walt is lying in the hospital bed, actually looking up at the ceiling tiles, and he's pointing out, here's where I want the hospital, here's where I want the athletic fields, we'll build housing over here, we'll have garbage chutes that'll run underground this way so that there's never garbage trucks or garbage on the streets. Everything's going to be underground. We'll have parking over here. We'll have one amusement park over here just to bring people to visit. And he's sketching out where everything is going to go in the Florida project. And he grows tired, his eyes slowly close, and Walt passes away on December 15th, 1966. Globally, it's news. Maybe not an entrepreneur since has captured the world's imagination since Walt Disney has. And the company that he started way back in 1923 actually eventually formally changes its name to honor the founder. It's no longer Disney Brothers Studio, it's the Walt Disney Company. That's why I think Walt Disney deserves his spot on the greatest American entrepreneurs of all time, if not the greatest American entrepreneur of all time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for wonderful talk. I will just, to give a summary of it, if we can learn like 3 main lessons from Walt Disney, because we're objectivists here, we try to build our lives, to be innovative, to be creative. But generally, what are the 3 main lessons that Walt Disney can teach every single one of us? So, maybe some just to summarize this wonderful speech. Thank you so much.
Yep, I think it's the importance of building a brand and having that brand mean something. A brand is not a logo. A brand is what people think about you based on the totality of the work you've done. So it's build a brand. I think Walt understood that the phrase creative risk is redundant. Like, risk is creative and creativity is taking an emotional risk. And so you're never going to get ahead in life unless you're willing to risk something. And then I think the third lesson is just playing the long game and realizing that, like, you pursue excellence for excellence sake. And if you're pursuing that in a business context, money is going to follow. But often the people who do things just for the money are not the people who have the most success. It's the people that focus on excellence, and then that becomes profitable if other people agree with your vision of excellence.
I remember once seeing a doodle that he had drawn that was his business plan right around the theme park era. And it was this really complicated, this, pumps that, pumps the other thing. And I was struck by, how brilliant it was. But at the same time, I would be hard tasked to describe, like, what's the purpose? If I were to ask you, stand on one foot and tell me what you think Walt Disney's purpose was, what would your answer be?
Okay, see here. I think Walt Disney's purpose was constantly looking to eliminate the cognitive dissonance between the vision he saw in his mind versus reality. He was completely unable to function. Like, he wasn't mentally healthy if he wasn't making progress towards his goals. If he had a business idea, whether it was making Snow White or building an amusement park or, the Mickey Mouse character, Walt also invented surround sound. Like, if you guys have ever used surround sound, Walt Disney invented that just for the movie Fantasia. And it totally flopped, lost stupid amounts of money. And yet, nearly 100 years later, all of us still use surround sound because Walt had this idea of, what if I have like an orchestra, so the common person, the common man can go to a movie and feel a world-class orchestra that's surrounding them. He invented, surround sound. He invented color in animation. He was the first person to ever use color. Lost incredible amounts of money early on until word spread of how amazing Disney cartoons were because they had color. Steamboat Willie came out in 1928, had sound. He thought, what if we put sound in an animated short? And everyone thought he was absolutely nuts, right? But when they saw it, they flocked to it. And so he gets proven right. I'm back on 2 feet. He's proven right time and time again that if I have this idea and I trust that other people have the same taste as I do, it's going to make money. I mean, that's like business 101, right? So create value for other people and profits follow.
I was just curious with the smash hit of Snow White. I think you said it was during the Depression. Was it the case that there was kind of not many other movies being made, and this was like the sole light at the time, or was there a lot of competition that it succeeded in spite of?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it comes out during the golden age of Hollywood. And so, yes, there's plenty of other movies, but it's hard for us to even compare. Like, I actually can't think of a modern example of like, oh, that's never been done before, right? Because people hadn't even conceptualized, I'm going to sit through a cartoon for 75 minutes. Like, what? You know, and they had never had any sense of story or pathos or substance. So just the whole project had never been attempted. So no, I don't think it's that there's a lack of competition. I mean, there's 25% unemployment when the movie comes out, right? And so people, like, the reason it had such crazy numbers is that many people saw it not just once or twice, but 2, 3, 4, 5 times. Many theaters were booked out 3 weeks in advance, all the shows, to get a ticket to Snow White. Eventually they start a club for kids on the weekends, where you can go in and watch like matinees, and the parents can drop off their kids at the movie theater to watch Disney films. And these clubs, the Mickey Mouse clubs that started in the 1930s, actually had more active membership than the combined Boys and Girl Scouts of America in the 1930s. It's just a play on brand. He realizes if we create characters and stories that people identify with, there's no constraint on what different business models can achieve if people fundamentally like the stories that you're telling, right?